It was a day like any other in the small town of Pineville, where life moved at a steady, familiar pace, and everyone seemed to know each other by name. Nestled at the heart of the town was Roosevelt Elementary School, a place that stood as a beacon of learning and community, and within those walls there was one teacher everyone adored, Mrs. Emily Parker. Mrs. Parker wasn't just another teacher. She was a shining light of kindness and understanding, the kind of person who saw potential where others saw problems. With her warm smile and gentle demeanor, she treated every student as if they were the most important person in the world. It didn't matter to her if the child was rich or poor, black or white. Each one deserved the same chance to learn and grow. Emily believed with all her heart that education was the key to building a more just and equal society, and that belief guided everything she did. But on that crisp autumn morning, as she arranged papers on her desk, Emily's gaze lingered on a boy sitting alone in the far corner of the classroom. He was small for his age, with a hollow look in his eyes and shoulders that slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. His name was Johnny Miller. Johnny wasn't like the other students. He didn't wear nice clothes or have a packed lunch like the rest. His hair was often messy, and his shoes were scuffed from long walks on gravel roads. Little was known about his family, except that they were one of the poorest in town. Johnny's mother worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on, and as for his father, well, nobody really talked about him. Johnny wasn't the kind of kid who shone in class. He kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and responding harshly if anyone tried to approach him. Teachers had long since given up on him, labeling him as trouble. He was the kind of student who seemed to go out of his way to push people away. But Mrs. Parker, with her compassionate heart, saw something different. She saw the pain hiding behind the bad attitude. She noticed the intelligence in his few, curt responses and the creativity that showed through the scattered, incomplete assignments he turned in. To her, Johnny wasn't a lost cause. He was a diamond in the rough, waiting for someone brave enough to dig him out. That same day, during recess, Emily approached Johnny with the same softness you might use to approach a wounded animal. "Johnny," she began, her voice steady but warm, "I know you're capable of so much more. I see it in you, even if you don't see it in yourself yet." Johnny glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He was used to harsh words, to eyes filled with disdain, but what he saw in Mrs. Parker's gaze was different. It was respect. It was belief. For the first time, someone was looking at him not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth fighting for. "Why do you care so much?" he muttered, his voice low and tinged with bitterness. "Because I believe in you, Johnny. And I believe that everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are." That moment was the first crack in the wall Johnny had built around himself. Over the next few days, Emily made it a point to pay extra attention to him. She praised even his smallest accomplishments, encouraged him to try harder, and stayed late after school to help him catch up on the work he had missed. And slowly, ever so slowly, Johnny began to change. He started to respond to Mrs. Parker's efforts. He'd stay a little longer after class, sometimes sharing snippets of his life, the loneliness at home, the struggles to focus on schoolwork when he was so worried about things no 12-year-old should have to think about. He even confided that there were nights he didn't sleep, lying awake listening to his mother crying quietly in the next room, wondering how they'd make it through another month. Mrs. Parker listened to every word with patience and empathy. She knew Johnny needed more than just a teacher. He needed someone who wouldn't give up on him when things got tough. And that's what she vowed to be. But not everyone at Roosevelt Elementary shared her views. To many, Johnny was nothing more than a disruption. Parents began to complain, insisting that Johnny was a bad influence on their children. They accused him of bringing down the quality of the classroom and threatened to pull their own kids out if Johnny remained. The tension began to mount, like a storm gathering force on the horizon. Emily knew that difficult times lay ahead, but she was prepared to fight for Johnny, no matter what. Because while others saw Johnny as a problem, Emily saw a promise she was determined to help him keep. Johnny's troubles didn't start at Roosevelt Elementary. They began long before he ever set foot in those polished hallways. His story was one of constant struggle, a story marked by hunger, by nights of uncertainty, and by the relentless grip of poverty that seemed to overshadow every aspect of his young life. Johnny's father had left when he was just a baby, and since then, it had been just him and his mother. She worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Their small, crumbling apartment barely held together, and the whispers of landlords demanding rent or the flickering lights threatening to go out were constants in Johnny's world. With all that chaos at home, school was never a priority. How could it be? For a while, Johnny tried to fit in at Roosevelt Elementary. He sat quietly in class, tried to complete assignments, even if he couldn't always understand them. But the differences between him and the other kids were stark. While they talked about summer camps and weekend trips to the city, Johnny's weekends were spent waiting for his mom to come home from a double shift. While they showed up in the newest sneakers, his shoes were worn thin, barely holding together. And kids noticed. "Hey, Johnny, where'd you get those shoes, the trash?" One boy sneered during recess. "Maybe your mom can afford some real ones if she stops working at the diner." Laughter erupted around him. Johnny clenched his fists, feeling the sting of shame rise up like bile in his throat. He wanted to lash out, to tell them they had no idea what it was like. But instead, he stayed quiet, bottling up his anger until it spilled out in other ways. Defiance in the classroom, missing assignments, even fights. Teachers quickly grew tired of his behavior and started avoiding him altogether. But not Mrs. Parker. She wasn't blind to his struggles, and she wasn't willing to write him off like so many others had. In the months that followed, she took Johnny under her wing, defending him against the harsh words of colleagues and parents alike. The complaints started small at first. A parent would murmur something about that boy and how he seemed like a bad influence. Whispers of dissatisfaction circled the school staff room, but they didn't bother Mrs. Parker. She continued working with Johnny after hours, sometimes slipping him snacks when she noticed he hadn't eaten, sometimes staying late to help him understand a math problem that had frustrated him all day. But as Johnny began to open up to her, his presence seemed to bother the other parents even more. Soon, those murmurs turned into loud, angry voices. Meetings were called, and parents, faces flushed with indignation, demanded that something be done. "He's bringing our children down, Mrs. Parker," one mother snapped, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "He's disruptive and rude. We don't want our kids around someone like him." "Someone like him?" Emily asked, her voice soft but with an edge. "Johnny is a child just like yours. He just needs a little help, a little understanding. What he needs is a different school," a father interrupted, his voice booming. "Somewhere he belongs. Maybe a place that can handle kids like that." Emily's heart twisted painfully at the implications. "Johnny is more than capable of learning alongside your children. He just needs support." "And what about our support?" another parent shouted. "Why should our kids suffer because you're so busy playing hero?" The words stung, but Emily stood her ground. Johnny had come so far already, and she couldn't, no, she wouldn't, let these people push him out. So she took a deep breath and with all the strength she could muster said, "If it's a matter of money, I'll pay for his schooling myself. I'll cover whatever costs he needs to stay here." There was a collective gasp in the room. Emily could see the disbelief and even a hint of anger in the faces around her. What kind of teacher would go to such lengths? What kind of person would take on such a burden for a boy like Johnny? But Emily didn't care. Johnny deserved a chance. She was willing to make sacrifices, even if it meant using her own meager savings to keep him in a school that could challenge him, that could open doors he never even knew existed. She hoped that her offer would settle the matter, that the parents would see how much she believed in him and understand. But instead, it only made things worse. The parents left the meeting angrier than ever. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting Emily's intentions into something unrecognizable. She was favoring the troublemaker. She was enabling bad behavior. They started calling her the Crusader, a name that once might have been a compliment, but now dripped with sarcasm and scorn. Emily felt the weight of their words pressing down on her every day. Colleagues she once considered friends stopped talking to her in the hallways. She overheard whispered comments, felt the sting of disapproving stares, but she kept her head high, pushing through it all for Johnny's sake. She wasn't going to give up on him. But just as Emily thought things couldn't get any worse, she was called into the principal's office one afternoon. She knew the look on his face before he even said a word. "I'm sorry, Emily," he began, not meeting her eyes. "The board has decided to let you go. There's just too much pressure. The parents have made it clear that either Johnny goes or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emily's world shattered in that moment. All the time, the effort, the love she'd poured into helping Johnny, it was being ripped away because she dared to believe in a child others had given up on. As she packed up her things, tears stinging her eyes, Johnny appeared at her classroom door. He looked at her, confusion and fear etched across his face. "Mrs. Parker, what's going on? Why are you leaving?" She knelt down in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Sometimes, doing the right thing comes with a price, Johnny," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to remember this. No matter what happens, you're worth fighting for. Don't ever let anyone make you think otherwise." Johnny nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Please don't leave me, Mrs. Parker." Emily pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. "I'm not leaving you, Johnny. I'm just not going to be here. But I'll always believe in you." And with that, she left Roosevelt Elementary, her heart breaking, but her resolve still strong. She had given Johnny everything she had. Now she could only hope it would be enough. The aftermath of Mrs. Parker's departure was like a wound that refused to heal. For weeks, the hallways of Roosevelt Elementary buzzed with conversations about her sudden exit. Some parents felt triumphant, believing they had restored order to the school. But for many students, it was a loss that left a gaping hole in their lives, especially for Johnny. Without Mrs. Parker's steady support and encouragement, Johnny drifted aimlessly. He didn't understand why she had to leave, why the person who believed in him more than anyone else was taken away. The first few days he showed up to class expecting to see her, hoping that somehow it had all been a mistake, but she never returned. And as reality set in, Johnny's progress began to unravel. He fell back into old habits, skipping classes, refusing to do assignments, lashing out at anyone who tried to get close. It was as if he had built up walls higher and thicker than ever before. Mrs. Parker had been the one person to see him as more than just a troublemaker, and now she was gone. He felt abandoned, betrayed by a world that seemed determined to crush any hope he'd dared to have. But Mrs. Parker wasn't done fighting for him. Even after being forced out of the school, she stayed in touch, sending him letters of encouragement, small notes that reminded him she still cared. Yet no letter could replace her presence in the classroom, and slowly Johnny slipped through the cracks. Meanwhile, Emily's own life took a sharp turn downhill. With the abrupt end of her teaching career, she found herself struggling to make ends meet. Teaching wasn't just a job for her, it was her calling, the thing that gave her life purpose and meaning. Now, all that was gone. Finding another position wasn't easy. Word of her controversial actions at Roosevelt had spread to other schools. People whispered that she was difficult, that she refused to follow the rules, that she caused trouble by stepping out of line. Emily knew that wasn't true, but reputations have a way of sticking, no matter how unfair they are. After months of searching, she finally managed to secure a position at a small, underfunded school on the other side of town. The pay was a fraction of what she used to earn, and the resources were scarce. Emily found herself in a classroom with barely enough desks for the students and a single worn-out textbook that was meant to serve an entire class. She often dipped into her own dwindling savings to buy supplies, determined to provide her new students with as much as she could. But as much as Emily tried to give her best, she couldn't deny that the job barely paid her bills. The money she made went to rent, groceries, and the basics. The comforts she'd once taken for granted, a cozy home, a reliable car, were now slipping away. One by one, she had to let them go. First, it was her car, sold off to cover a few months' worth of rent. Then she moved out of her modest house into a small, cramped apartment that leaked whenever it rained. As the debts piled up and the pressures mounted, Emily felt her spirit start to wear thin. It was a bitter irony. She'd been pushed out for helping a student who needed her, and now she was the one who needed help. But Emily wasn't one to give up easily. Even as she struggled, she remained steadfast in her belief that she had done the right thing. She continued writing to Johnny, sending words of encouragement, letting him know she hadn't forgotten him. She reminded him of his potential, of the bright future she still believed he could have. Her letters were short, filled with simple but powerful messages. "I'm so proud of you, Johnny. Don't let them convince you that you're anything less than amazing. I know it's hard, but I believe in you. Keep pushing forward no matter what. The world is a better place because you're in it. Don't ever doubt that." The letters were her lifeline to the boy she'd fought so hard to protect, but she had no way of knowing if he even read them. No replies ever came. One day, as Emily sat in her tiny apartment, staring at an overdue electricity bill, she felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had lost so much: her job, her stability, and now, she feared, her purpose. But even as the darkness closed in, Emily clung to one small glimmer of hope: Johnny. If she could just make sure he knew someone still believed in him, maybe it would all be worth it. Meanwhile, at Roosevelt, Johnny's absence began to be felt more acutely. With no one left to advocate for him, he had become a ghost, drifting through classes without participating, skipping school altogether on many days. The teachers who once complained about him found themselves uneasy. His empty desk was a stark reminder of the cost of their victory. They had rid themselves of a troublemaker. But at what cost? Johnny's silence screamed louder than any disruption he had ever caused. Emily didn't know it yet, but Johnny kept every single one of her letters. He hid them in a small, tattered box under his bed, taking them out whenever the weight of the world became too much. Those letters were his anchor, his reminder that there was at least one person out there who saw something good in him. But the world had other plans. As Emily's financial situation worsened, she was forced to take on a second job cleaning offices late at night. The exhaustion was relentless, but she endured it with quiet dignity. She'd always taught her students that setbacks were temporary, that perseverance was the key. Now she had to live by those words herself. What neither Emily nor Johnny could have imagined was that the darkest days were just the prelude to something far greater, because sometimes it's in the depths of despair that the seeds of hope begin to grow. The years that followed were some of the hardest Emily Parker had ever known. She fell deeper into financial hardship, working day and night to make ends meet. Her small salary from teaching at the underfunded school barely covered the essentials. The late-night cleaning shifts added a few more dollars to her pocket, but they took a toll on her health. Her once bright eyes, always sparkling with hope and energy, now showed signs of fatigue. Dark circles etched themselves under her eyes, and the smile that used to come so naturally was more and more often replaced by a tired, pained expression. Emily had always prided herself on being resilient, but this was different. It felt like the world was pressing down on her inch by inch, testing her resolve until she had nothing left to give. But even in the face of all this, Emily kept going. Every morning she'd wake up before dawn, pack a modest lunch, and head to the small rundown school on the edge of town. She was determined to be the same loving, dedicated teacher for her new students that she had been for Johnny. She didn't want them to see the cracks forming beneath her composed exterior. The school, however, was a far cry from Roosevelt Elementary. The classrooms were overcrowded, the desks old and battered. Resources were scarce, and textbooks were outdated, often missing entire chapters. But what broke Emily's heart most was the apathy she saw in her students' eyes. They came from families like Johnny's, families struggling to survive, where education was often the last thing on anyone's mind. Many of these kids had already accepted failure as their fate, believing that dreams were only for people who could afford them. Emily knew that feeling. She'd seen it in Johnny's eyes so many years ago, and it pained her to see it again, multiplied in the faces of so many children. Determined not to let that despair take root, she threw herself into her work, doing everything she could to make the classroom a place of hope and possibility. Even when she was bone-tired from cleaning offices until midnight, she never missed a day of school. Even when she had to skip meals to make sure her students had pencils and paper, she never let her smile falter in front of them. She began holding after-school sessions, staying late to help struggling students, or just listen to them talk about their lives. She encouraged them to dream, even when the world told them not to. Slowly, she began to see glimmers of hope in those young faces. A spark here, a curious question there. She knew it wasn't much, but it was something. But no amount of hope could pay the bills. No amount of dedication could bring back the stability she'd lost. The debt collectors were relentless. Every month, new letters arrived in her mailbox, bold red print screaming out their demands. Final notice, outstanding balance, utility termination. The day she lost her apartment was the day Emily Parker hit rock bottom. She had been coming back from a long day at school, her feet aching from standing for hours. When she reached her apartment building, she found a notice taped to her door: eviction. Everything she owned, just a few boxes of books, clothes, and cherished memories, was piled in the hallway. She felt her knees weaken beneath her as she stared at the stark words on the paper. Her stomach twisted in a way that made her feel sick. How had it come to this? Emily didn't have family nearby. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had no siblings. She was alone, with nowhere to turn. She spent that night in her car, parked in the lot of a 24-hour convenience store, the cool leather seats her only comfort. She cried quietly, muffling the sound with her hands so no one would hear. "I did everything right," she whispered through sobs. "I did everything I was supposed to. So why does it feel like I'm being punished for doing good?" But as the tears dried on her cheeks, a familiar resolve began to build in her chest. Emily knew there was no use in asking why. Life wasn't fair, and she had taught herself that long ago. What mattered now was how she moved forward. So she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and told herself that this was just one more challenge she would overcome. In the weeks that followed, Emily stayed with a former colleague who offered her a place to sleep until she could get back on her feet. It was a temporary arrangement, but it gave her the space to figure out her next move. She doubled down on her work at school, pouring every ounce of herself into her students, clinging to the one thing that still made sense: helping kids who needed someone to believe in them. She also continued to write to Johnny, though she never received a reply. There was always a small part of her that hoped he was doing okay, that somewhere he'd found a way to keep moving forward. She pictured him reading her letters, maybe smiling at her words of encouragement, but she didn't let herself dwell on it for long. Johnny had his own life now. He didn't need to worry about her. She'd be fine somehow. And then one day, as she sat at the small wobbly table in her colleague's kitchen, staring at another bill she couldn't pay, Emily got a message that would change everything. It was a plain envelope, addressed to her in neat, precise handwriting. Inside there was a note, a simple invitation to meet someone at a cafe downtown. No name, no details, just a time and an address. For a moment, Emily considered ignoring it. She didn't have time for mysteries, but something in the back of her mind urged her to go. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just a glimmer of hope that she wasn't as alone as she felt. Whatever it was, the next morning, she found herself standing outside a small cafe, her heart racing with anticipation and uncertainty. She stepped inside, and there, sitting at a table near the window, was a man she hadn't seen in years. He was taller now, his posture confident and his suit immaculate. But when he looked up and their eyes met, Emily felt a rush of recognition and emotion that took her breath away. "It was Johnny. Mrs. Parker?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "Is it really you?" Emily's lips trembled as she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Johnny, But before she could finish, Johnny stood up, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you for so long." For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke. Emily could only stare at the young man standing in front of her. This wasn't the lost boy she'd once known. This was a man who'd grown into himself, who stood tall and proud. But those eyes, they were still the same, full of depth and intensity, full of a story that only she knew the beginning of. "Johnny?" she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Mrs. Parker, it's me." Johnny took a tentative step forward, then another until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out and for a moment they both hesitated. Then he pulled her into a gentle, heartfelt hug, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he let go. "I can't believe I finally found you," he murmured. "I've been looking for years." Emily stepped back, studying his face with a mixture of pride and awe. He looked so different, yet so much the same. "But how? Why? I didn't think you'd want to see me after everything that happened." Johnny shook his head vehemently. "I owe everything to you, Mrs. Parker. You believed in me when no one else did. You saw something in me that even I couldn't see, and I never forgot that." He gestured for her to sit down, and as they took their seats at the small cafe table, he began to tell his story. After she left Roosevelt Elementary, things had gotten worse for him. He fell into old habits, anger, bitterness, and fights. With no one to advocate for him, Johnny had been expelled within a year. He bounced around from one underfunded school to another, always struggling to keep his head above water. But every time he felt like giving up, he'd pull out one of her letters and read it again. Her words kept him going. "I believe in you, Johnny. Don't let them convince you that you're anything less than amazing." He could almost hear her voice urging him not to give up. "I thought about quitting so many times," Johnny confessed, his gaze dropping to the table. "But then I'd remember how hard you fought for me, how much you gave up just to keep me in that school, and I realized I couldn't let your sacrifice be for nothing. I had to prove to you and to myself that I was worth it." He went on to explain how he'd pushed through, clawing his way up from the bottom. He found a mentor, someone who saw potential in him, someone who reminded him a little bit of Mrs. Parker. With guidance and a lot of hard work, he managed to graduate high school. From there, he set his sights on college, using every scholarship and grant he could get his hands on. "But that wasn't enough," he said, his voice growing stronger, more assured. "I wanted to do more, to be more. So I went to medical school." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Medical school?" Johnny nodded. "It wasn't easy. It took everything I had, but I made it through. I'm a surgeon now, Mrs. Parker. A cardiothoracic surgeon." He paused, watching as Emily absorbed this information, her expression shifting from surprise to awe. I don't know what to say," she murmured, shaking her head slightly. "I always knew you were capable of great things, Johnny. But you've achieved so much." "It's because of you," he said firmly. "If it weren't for you, I never would have made it this far. You saved my life, Mrs. Parker, and I've been trying to find a way to repay you ever since." Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it towards her. "Open it," he urged gently. With trembling fingers, Emily lifted the flap and pulled out a piece of paper. As she read the contents, her eyes widened, and she looked up at Johnny in disbelief. This is... "It's a job offer," Johnny said softly. "I started my own medical practice, and we've been expanding. I want you to come work for me, Mrs. Parker. I want you to help run our educational outreach program, to be in charge of all the initiatives we're launching to support underprivileged kids who want to go into medicine. I know it's not the same as teaching, but I want you to have a chance to keep making a difference, like you did for me." Emily could hardly process the words. "Johnny, I'm not qualified for something like this. I'm just a teacher." "You're not just a teacher," Johnny interrupted, his voice fierce. "You're the reason I'm standing here today. You have no idea how many lives you've already changed just by being you. And this is your chance to reach even more people, to give other kids the same hope you gave me." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she looked at the young man who had once been a scared, angry boy in her classroom. He was offering her a chance to get back what she had lost. More than that, he was offering her a way to build something even greater. And he was right. She could make a difference. I don't know what to say," she whispered, wiping her cheeks. "Johnny, this is..." "Say yes," he said softly, smiling at her. "Please, let me help you the way you helped me." Emily took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. Yes, of course I'll do it. The relief and joy that lit up Johnny's face were almost overwhelming. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Thank you, Mrs. Parker, for everything. I'll never be able to repay you, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying. Life. And with that, the two of them sat there, hands clasped, tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces. It was a new beginning, not just for Johnny, but for Emily too. A chance to rebuild, to reclaim her purpose, and to continue making the world a better place, one child, one heart at a time.